Well, now that I'm sufficiently, can everyone hear me, I guess? Now that I'm sufficiently intimidated by my introduction, let me start by saying how happy I am to be here with you this afternoon. I have spoken to, gosh, I don't know how many different historical societies in Ohio over the last 10 years, and you certainly have the loveliest setting that I have ever encountered, and also I would say one of the most rewarding meals. Between the dinner I had last night at Sally Williams's and the banquet today, I'm going to have to go on a diet when I get back to Southern Ohio, but I very much appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. I'm here to talk about Ohio, and I have to tell you first of all that I talk about Ohio as a native son, and there's no way to avoid that. I became interested in thinking about Ohio when I was very young, and it had to do as much with an accident of birth as anything else. My family is actually from Kentucky. Both sides of my family were from Kentucky. And I was born in 1954, not so long ago, and my parents lived in Kentucky, but the hospital was in Ohio, Christ Hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio. So my father had to drive my mother across the bridge into Ohio to give birth to me and then to my 4 younger sisters who followed in successive years. This was the baby boom right in the middle of it, of course, and so there was a baby almost every year in our household until 1961 when the pill was invented. Not a moment too soon as far as my parents were concerned. But the fact that I was born in Ohio has fascinated me for a long time, in part because I was taken home from the hospital back to Kentucky. And my grandparents' relatives, my mother's father's relatives, whom I knew very well growing up, never let me forget the fact that I was born in Ohio. And they referred to me always as that strange young boy who was born across the river. And then that got shortened to Buckeye Boy. So when I would go see my great uncles when I was 23 and 24 years old, I would walk in and they would say, "Why, it's Buckeye Boy, welcome back to Kentucky." Now, what always struck me as strange about this was I lived the first 10 years of my life in Kentucky. My family was from Kentucky. I identified with Kentucky. And yet somehow, simply because of the accident of birth, I was born in Ohio. Growing up in the greater Cincinnati area, Cincinnati was a fascinating place to a young kid in the late 50s and 60s. My grandmothers both worked over in Cincinnati. My father worked at the University of Cincinnati Library. We went to Cincinnati for fun. The Cincinnati Reds, which were my passion when I was growing up in the 1960s, were in Cincinnati. And Ohio always had this kind of exotic quality to me in a kind of strange way that many people find hard to grasp, simply because going to Cincinnati, going across the river into Ohio, was quite a big deal for me and my sisters. We had to get dressed up, and we put on a little coat and tie, and I would go across to go shopping. We went there to see Santa Claus. We went there to do all these things. And Ohio, therefore, had a kind of lure for me, or allure, that it probably didn't for a lot of people. And as I grew older, particularly when I went away to college at the University of Virginia and then went to graduate school in Rhode Island, as Paul mentioned, I became even more interested in what it meant to be from Ohio. Because when you go away from somewhere, of course, is where you become more aware of the fact that you belong in the place from which you came. That is, if we think about identity and we think about who we are, I think you're never more conscious of that than you are when you are away from that place for a considerable amount of time. I've never thought more about what it meant to be an American, for example, than when I'm in Europe or in some other part of the world. And when I lived in Virginia, I remember saying to myself, well, they don't do things here the way that they do them in Ohio. Or when I went to graduate school in Rhode Island, I felt the same way. And indeed, when I had to write my first seminar paper in a graduate colloquium, my wife and I were trying to think of a topic for me. She was also in graduate school. She already had her topic. I did not have one. And we drove across Providence, Rhode Island, looking for a pizza parlor, which was supposed to be famous, and we couldn't find it because the streets were all a mess, like they'd followed the cows, which of course they literally had, and laying out the place. And I said, well, why isn't Providence like Cincinnati, where the streets are wide and laid out in rectangular fashion so you can get away? And my wife looked at me and said, well, did most of the people who settled Ohio come from Rhode Island and Massachusetts? And I said, yes. And she said, well, maybe there's something worth thinking about there. And the result was that I've spent the next 30 years of my life trying to figure out why the streets in Cincinnati are rectangular as opposed to looking to Rhode Island. But I've also spent that time trying to figure out exactly what it means to be from Ohio, much of which has to do with trying to counter the image that Ohio has in the early 21st century and that I think it acquired in the second half of the 20th century as being a kind of bland place. And this is something that drives me crazy as a native son of Ohio. That Ohio, like much of the Midwest, is homogeneous and boring and predictable. That if you want excitement, you go to New York City, or you want to go to Los Angeles. If you want excitement of a certain kind, you go to New York City, or you go to Los Angeles. That Midwesterners, and Ohioans in particular, live in a kind of culture that emphasizes a kind of what people have in common and a kind of generic quality to it. This has always annoyed me because I've thought throughout my life that the Ohio I know is a remarkably diverse place. In fact, one of the things about Ohio that makes it difficult to talk about is it is so diverse. If you think about Ohio as a state, it has no real coherence to it. Many people have pointed out over the years that Ohio essentially consists of 4 different quadrants. Southeastern Ohio, which has more in common in many ways with Virginia and West Virginia. Southwestern Ohio, where I live now, near Cincinnati, which has, in many ways, Cincinnati has more in common with Louisville, Kentucky, and Nashville, Tennessee than it does with Cleveland or Toledo. Northwestern Ohio, where you all live, and Northeastern Ohio, which certainly seems to be much more tied in demographically and politically and economically with New York and Buffalo and Pittsburgh in some ways. And then in the middle we have Columbus, which doesn't seem to belong to any of the rest of it, and nobody really seems to want to claim. So what is it about this place? When you read the Constitution of Ohio, you'll notice that they didn't even know what to say. The Constitution of Ohio begins, stating that the people who live in the territory defined by the Ohio River to the south, Lake Erie to the north, and all these measurements, which are sort of arbitrary lines on a map, and really seem to make no sense at all. So the more I studied the history of Ohio, the more I thought about the development of Ohio as a state within the Union, the more I became even more intrigued by this question of whether or not there was anything to a sense of being from Ohio. Was Ohio a distinctive place? Did Ohioans have a specific identity? Was Ohio something unique in the rest of the world? Or was it simply something that those of us who grow up there end up with an affection for because it's our home? It's the place we were born and grew up, and so there, of course, we find we have some kind of special connection or ties with it. And that's one of the reasons why I studied it. And I spent a lot of my time trying to understand the origins of Ohio. And it leads to the title of my talk today, which is When Ohio Was the Center of the World. And more than one of you have already pointed out to me, what do you mean Ohio still is the center of the world? And clearly your historical approach is getting in the way of your sanity. But what I mean by this is that 19th century Ohio was a very different place from 20th and 21st century Ohio. And I think much of that difference had to do with the attitudes that the people who lived in Ohio and came to Ohio had in the 19th century. Ohio in the 19th century was a proudly diverse place. It was a place where people celebrated differences, geographical differences, but also ethnic and religious differences. Cincinnati, Ohio, in the census of 1860, was the single most diverse city in the United States of America. Even more so than Brooklyn or Manhattan in 1860. There were something like 30 different languages spoken in Cincinnati in 1860. And as most of you know, since Cleveland and Toledo surpassed that by the end of the 19th century with a huge proportion of people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe and others. Many of you probably descended from some of these people. Germans made up the primary migrants to Ohio in the 19th century, and today I believe the statistic is that 40% of Ohioans are still descended in some way or another from Germans, although of course for reasons I don't have to spell out, that sort of got put under the rug in the middle of the 20th century. So Ohio in the 19th century was or became a place that attracted people from all over the world. people came here. They came here because they wanted security, because they wanted stability, because they wanted to take care of their families, because they thought Ohio was a place where they could live a good, comfortable, safe existence. But at the same time, they also came to Ohio because it was for many people what they called a promised land. That term comes most specifically from enslaved African Americans who saw Ohio as the land across the River Jordan, a land of freedom and a land of opportunity. But that was also true of many white Americans who moved here, and also of many Europeans who came to Ohio in the 19th century. And when you look back at it, you look back at some of these things people said, and it's just almost impossible to believe that they had the kind of ideas and the kind of values that they had in the early 19th century. One of the early founders of Ohio, for example, said that Ohio was to be the center of a great empire. And they imagined that the capital of the United States would one day exist in Ohio. They imagined that Ohio in the 19th century would become the model for the rest of the world. That they were not simply building houses and establishing farms and developing roads, but that they were creating a kind of revolutionary, liberating, energizing society that was going to make the world a better place. And part of what developed in the history of Ohio in the 19th century and into the 20th century was this kind of tension that developed between, on the one hand, people's desire to protect themselves and their security and to take care of their families and to make money and to get ahead, which means they didn't want to pay taxes. And on the other hand, their desire to see Ohio as an engine of social reform and social change, a revolutionary kind of idea. Very hard in many ways for us to wrap our heads around this today. The idea that people would say Ohio was the future. Ohio was not the past. Ohio was the place that would model for the rest of the United States and the rest of the world a society of prosperity, a society of equality, and a society of harmony. And so whether they were talking in religious terms, political terms, or economic terms, this notion, this vision of Ohio as the center of a great empire was something that dominated 19th century Ohio. Now, what was this vision all about when people wanted Ohio to be at the center of the world? Well, what it amounted to more than anything else was a sense of civic responsibility. And this is a term that I'm not sure we're entirely comfortable with or fully understand anymore in the 21st century, not just in Ohio, but in the United States in general. That is that to live in Ohio entitled people not only to certain rights and privileges of citizenship, but also certain obligations as well, too. As one American leader put it in the 1820s, liberty is power, and God gives us power to use that power for good in the world, not simply to protect ourselves from our enemies and people who would destroy us. This sense, then, of obligation, this sense that somehow or another people in Ohio had a responsibility to serve their fellow citizens was one of the most important themes in the history of Ohio from its very beginning in 1803 up until the beginning of the 20th century. And people from all over the world came here for this. They came to see it, they came to observe it, they came to learn from it and to do what Ohioans thought it should be. This vision had several key features to it, many of which had been outlined in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, but as I said, it came down to basically a sense of civic responsibility, and those might be summarized in 3 or 4 major points. The most important of which was a commitment to the rule of law. Now, we may take this for granted in the 21st century, but in the early 19th century, people all over the world did not take that for granted. The idea that a just society, a democratic society, a capitalistic society promised not simply prosperities to people, but what we would eventually call, after the Civil War, due process and the treatment legally before the law, that the law represented the not only security for people, but promise for people, that they could here enjoy the blessings of liberty and that they could, in fact, take those blessings to other people. Law was tremendously important. And because law was important, government was important too. Government people were not as afraid of in the 19th century as they became well, they were afraid of it, but they also saw the possibilities of it. Many people did in the 19th century. That government could develop infrastructure, what they called internal improvements. Government could build canals, government could build roads. Governments could do things that would encourage people to trade and exchange and be with each other and to create this garden in the center of the world. They also came down to two other really central ideas, one of which was religion. And this is a topic that often gets overlooked by historians, but 19th century Ohio was predominantly a Protestant Christian society in which people believed, particularly in this part of the state, the northern part of the state, that there was a mission and that mission involved a service of God in a particular concrete way to help free people, to improve them, and to bring them into a better part of life. And the last, and this won't surprise you given my occupation, was education. The notion that in a democracy that people had to learn, not just to read and write, not just to be able to get good jobs, but they had to learn history, that they had to study politics, that they had to study literature and art, that they had to understand the human condition and how the world operated so that they could make informed choices when they vote, so that they would vote not simply on the basis, as most of us will, of self-interest, but that they would think, look, people in the past have done things where they sacrificed for future generations, and so therefore it is incumbent upon us to carry forward that tradition. History then was critical in education in the 19th century, and one of the most important features of the Ohio landscape in the 19th century was the proliferation, not just of the proverbial schoolhouses, but of colleges almost everywhere. Protestant denominational colleges in almost every town in Ohio. And universities like mine, Miami University, which was chartered by the state of Ohio in 1809, but was run by Presbyterian ministers throughout much of the 19th century. This confluence then, this conjoinment of law, education, religion together in a vision was designed to create a structure, an environment, a place called Ohio that would allow people, educated, civilized people who would think about things, to pursue happiness, to do what was best for themselves, to improve the lives of their family, to enjoy the riches and bounties of the United States in the 19th century in as much freedom as possible, but within a structure that encouraged them to be thoughtful, not to be impulsive, to think ahead, and to think of themselves, most importantly, as part of something bigger than themselves. That you are part of a fabric that includes other people, people dead, as well as people in the future. And so in 19th century Ohio, when Ohio was the center of the world, I'm being quite literal about that. People thought it was. They came here. Ohio became the center of most of the major reform movements in the 19th century. Anti-slavery was particularly strong in Ohio. The Republican Party, which grew in part in the 1850s as an anti-slavery party, was strong in Ohio. Ohio provided the leaders of the anti-slavery movement, from Salmon P. Chase and Giddings and all the rest of them that you know. Ohio sent more soldiers into the Union Army than virtually any other northern state. And it certainly provided some of the most famous leaders of that army, from Ulysses Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, James Garfield, on down the line. Well, that wasn't coincidental. It happened because this notion of civic culture in Ohio taught people that they had to do these kinds of things. And when Union soldiers from Ohio and Michigan and Indiana marched through Tennessee and Georgia, what did they write home about? They write home about, in South Carolina, they don't have schools. In South Carolina, where are the churches? In South Carolina, where is the civic space, the public culture? It's our job not only to free the slave and to bring South Carolina back into the Union, it is to show these South Carolinians that Ohio is the model of the future. And that model depends upon a civic culture rooted in law, religion, and education. What was the greatest sin of the Carolinians as far as the Ohio soldiers were concerned? They had broken the law. The United States could not exist, according to them, if people just out of whatever reason decided, I'm not going to obey this law, and if I don't like your law, I'm going to pull out. Sherman famously said, you know, if we let the South secede, and Sherman didn't care about slavery really one way or the other, said, if we let the South secede, what will they do? Well, then every county and every state will secede every time it doesn't like a law, and every township and every city. And so it had to be stopped here. In the same way, Ohio was the center in the 19th century of the greatest temperance reform movement, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was one of the great female-driven reform societies of the 19th century world, let alone the United States. Where did it get its start? Washington Courthouse, Ohio, and Hillsborough. Thousands of women, Protestant women, showing up at saloons, particularly after the American Civil War, when their husbands and brothers were still drinking like soldiers do sometimes when they come home, and saying, no more of this. Arguing, in effect, that you should stop drinking because drinking led you to neglect your responsibilities as a father and a husband. It made you a lousy citizen. It made you follow your emotions rather than rational decisions and rational behavior, and we couldn't have that. And what they argued, and this was the essence of anti-slavery as well, was that reform has to come from within. You cannot force people to change. You cannot say, stop drinking and fine them or punish them or throw them in jail. Of course you can do that. But if you really want change to take place, it has to come from within. It has to be an internal transformation that somehow people choose to become a different kind of person. And in many ways, this notion of choice, this notion of change through persuasion, was at the essence of this civic culture in Ohio in the 19th century. That's what education was about. That's what the Protestant religion was about. That was about the law was about to some extent, was to get people to think about who they were and what they did, and to make choices, informed choices, and to accept responsibility for those choices. So whether you go to war, whether you are drinking, whatever it might be, most reform in 19th century Ohio then was about encouraging people to choose to be better kinds of persons. And you see then in 19th century Ohio the transformation of a landscape, the creation of public space. You see buildings that echo Greece. Columbus, Ohio, the State House, Greek Revival style, one of the few State House buildings in the United States. You see courthouses in virtually every small town in Ohio, built in a kind of often neo-Gothic style, but also trying to conjure up some sense of some glorious past. You see public schools, opera houses, those opera houses that have been renovated into movie theaters or sometimes destroyed altogether in all these Ohio towns. They showed Shakespeare. Shakespeare was one of the most popular playwrights in the 19th century. They had opera there. They had lectures. They had people like me who came in and, well, not people like me, but important famous people like Charles Dickens and others who would come and talk, and people would turn out. And they thought that that was part of their responsibility. They went to be entertained, yes. They didn't have TV and radio and all that other kind of stuff. But they also went because they thought part of their responsibility was to become better informed and better educated. They read newspapers. Ohio was flooded with newspapers. Newspapers were all about exchanging information, finding out what's going on somewhere else. How does what we're doing have an impact in California or in France or vice versa in all these ways? They developed public spaces, courthouses and central squares in towns so that people would have a place to gather, so there would become some kind of central organizing place. Parades, to have parades several times a year in town, where the town would literally parade itself with its important figures in the high school band and all these other kinds of things to demonstrate the kind of unity and coherence and solidity of the town. And by the late 19th century, as Ohio, many people thought, was beginning to fail in this mission a little bit, where people seemed to be more and more interested in simply getting ahead, what you see was a massive reform movement, what we call the progressive movement in the late 19th and early 20th century. Where did that begin? Ohio. Where was it practiced? Cleveland. Mayor Johnson, Tom Johnson, you may know in Cleveland, and one of his major things he did was to say we need to rebuild downtown Cleveland to have big public buildings and wider streets and squares, which you can still see in downtown Cleveland today, because this kind of neoclassical style will encourage people to remind themselves of their citizenship. People from Glasgow and Paris and Berlin came to Cleveland in the early 1900s to study city government. In the same way that Golden Rule Jones in where? Toledo, Ohio, one of the most famous cities in the world, in the early 20th century, because Golden Rule Jones combined that kind of Protestant business civic commitment to moral improvement. So when I say Ohio was the center of the world, what I'm saying to a large extent is Ohio succeeded in the 19th century in making itself a model. People came here, they studied, they thought about it, they looked at it and said, yes, this is a good way to do things. It is no coincidence that at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, president after president after president was from where? Ohio. And even those men who were more distinguished and important politicians, John Sherman, Mark Hanna, were from Ohio. Where were the leading novelists from? William Dean Howells and later James Thurber and others. Ohio. Baseball players from Ohio. Inventors from Ohio. On and on and on and on. It got so bad that early in the 20th century, in 1910, I think it was Orville Wright, airplane, right, was giving a speech at the Ohio Club of New York. Because every major city in the United States in the early 20th century had an Ohio Club, where people who were born and grew up in Ohio got together and had dinner once a month. Because to be from Ohio was something you were terrifically proud of, because Ohio ran the Congress, Ohio dominated industry, Rockefeller, and on and on and on. Ohio was the center of the United States, which ipso facto made it the center of the world. And Orville got up, of course, and said, what have I learned in my life? He said, I've learned this. If you want to be successful in life, get yourself a good mother and father, get yourself a certain amount of luck, and make sure you're born in Ohio. Now, that kind of attitude, which today I think would strike many people as, kind of funny, strikes me as funny, was in fact what many people believed in the early part of the 20th century. Now, what happened to that attitude in the 20th century seems to have been, like in many parts of the United States, was, and my argument would be, that 19th century Ohioans were so successful in creating the kind of world that they wanted, that in the 20th century, we enjoy the fruits and benefits, essentially, of what they did. We live better than any other people in the world, in the history of the world. We are better educated, no matter what you hear about all these stories about how people don't know about the past. Well, they didn't know much in 1900 either. More people know more about the past today in the United States than at any time in the history of the world. More people participate in local government and local organizations than anywhere else in the world. Your wonderful organization, and I'm being sincere, not ironic, your wonderful organization is the essence of what 19th century Ohioans wanted. People voluntarily coming together, associating themselves, electing their own officers, spending their own money, volunteering of their time to preserve the stories, the traditions, the buildings, the architecture of that past, not simply because it's pretty and not simply to bring tourists to see it, but because there was some kind of educational value to that as well. Because, as was said in the invocation, part of what history is all about is maintaining faith with those people who gave up their lives and gave up their time and gave up their future to ensure that we would live a comfortable life. Now, the tension between security and idealism still remains with us today. It is also true that the kind of notion of reform that I talk about can very quickly become imperial, and in fact it did. I dare say that our friends in South Carolina were not all too fond of our friends of Ohio who showed up and told them how to live their lives. And one of the things, of course, that they learned was that no matter how much Ohio was a model, it could not reconstruct South Carolina, and certainly failed in that, although that does not keep the United States from trying to reconstruct other places in the image of Ohio over the course of the 20th and 21st century. So what does this all end up to? What I think it all adds up to is, when I think about it, is what is history and why do I do it? Well, I do it in part because I'm interested in who I am, where I came from. I'm interested in understanding my relationship, not just to my family, to my students, and to my colleagues and friends, but to the people before me, and the people before them, and also the people after me as well, too. You know, when I was about, probably 12 years ago, I, like many people my age, drove a minivan and was a chauffeur for two young girls. Our older daughter Elizabeth, who was born in 1984, and our younger daughter Hannah, who was born in 1988. And I spent much of the early 1990s driving around southwestern Ohio and actually into Michigan at ice skating events, swim meets. My all-time favorite t-shirt ever, have you ever seen this? I hope that the last day on earth I am at a swim meet because it will never end. But I drove my daughters everywhere, and of course we would take their friends with them. And Elizabeth was probably, I don't know, maybe 8 years old or something like that. And I was driving her someplace, and I was trying to sort of not pay attention to what they were saying. And then I heard them start talking about what their parents did for a living. And one's father was a lawyer, and another was an accountant. So they said, "So Elizabeth, what does your father do?" And he said, "Well, he's a historian." And they, "What's a historian do?" And we were driving by a cemetery. And Elizabeth looked out at the cemetery and said, "That's what my daddy does." And I thought to myself, huh? Do I go and dig graves or make headstones? What is it? And so I turned to her and I said, "Elizabeth, what do you mean?" "That's what daddy does." And she says, "My daddy tells stories about dead people so they're not really dead." Out of the mouth of babes, right? In all wisdom. So I think what we can take away from these stories in the study of history, or what at least I take away from them, what you all take away from them is up to you, is pretty much what we've seen today in this meeting and what I hope you will continue to do. That is a commitment to the idea of history as stories about dead people. Stories about dead people that keep them alive, but not only keep them alive, but keep their ideas alive. That keep, what Abraham Lincoln said at one point, the sense that somehow or another they had given the last full measure of devotion to the United States and to Ohio and to what it would become. In the end, my favorite quotation from Ohio is actually from a newspaper in Kentucky. And it said in 1793, "When we are in the world, we must be in the world. We must feel others' pain. We must enjoy others' pleasure. We must keep ourselves informed and in touch with all parts of the world to the extent that we are able then to identify with other people's situation, we can better identify with ourselves." And what I would say to you more than anything else is, Ohio was the center of the world in the 19th century because Ohioans cared about being at the center of the world, and because they were committed in one way or another to changing that world. So if we take lessons from Ohio, then perhaps the greatest lesson is that Ohio has been most important in the history of the United States and most important in the history of the world when Ohioans have primarily thought of themselves as citizens, citizens committed to reform, citizens committed to improvement, citizens committed to something larger themselves, and citizens above all as human beings who live in a world of fellow human beings. Thank you very much for your attention, and I got you out in time to go see to see Ben Roethlisberger beat the Browns this afternoon. Sorry, I have to say that because of course Ben went to Miami University. Do you want me to take any questions, or would that be appropriate? I mean, I know you probably want to get going, but if anybody has any comments or questions you'd like to ask, I'd be happy to entertain them. Yes, sir, back there in the back.
Kentucky and Ohio. One of the things that I've discovered is that although Lake Erie extends to the middle of the lake, that Kentucky owns the Ohio River.
That's correct.
And West Virginia owns the Ohio River to the northern shore. Could you comment on how that happened?
Sure. Don't worry, it won't take very long. It's always dangerous to ask a history professor to explain something like that. Simply it was that Virginia claimed at the end of the American Revolution, the War for Independence, Virginia owned Kentucky. And Kentucky and West Virginia were parts of the Commonwealth of Virginia. So the entire state of Virginia consisted of what is now Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. Virginia also claimed the territory northwest of the Ohio River by virtue of George Rogers Clark's victory at Vincennes, which was a very tenuous claim, but they claimed it anyway. So when the national government in the 1780s worked on Virginia to give up the claim to what is now Ohio and Indiana and Illinois so it could be federal territory, Virginia reluctantly gave up that claim in return for two concessions, one of which was that veterans of the Revolutionary War who were Virginians be allowed to locate land warrants in the territory northwest. And if you've been to the area around Chillicothe in the Scioto River Valley, it's not nearly as well laid out as the rest of this region. That's because Virginians settled there. And the other thing they asked for was that they wanted control of the Ohio River in order to charge tolls or whatever it might be, so they got claim to the river to the north bank. And then Kentucky inherited that when it became a state. Anything else? Well, let me say how much of a pleasure it's been here, and I would particularly like to thank Sally Williams, who has just been a terrific host, and Nancy Dunham, and also your husband, Dick. Where is he? Who made, I want to tell you, last night, absolutely the best apple pie I have had in so long I can't even remember. It was worth the trip up here just for that. So thank you very much.
Last little remarks were on tape because about our association, they were so nice. And we'll have to replay those.
Do.
Thank you so
Sure.
much for coming.
My pleasure.
You all must watch for our programs next year. We haven't got them all in place yet, but we'll be announcing in our newsletters, and we hope to see you